Kia ora, good morning everyone, Zeapon here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at another lens from Meike. This is the Meike 85mm f1.8 Pro. This is an autofocus lens, and this lens is available for Nikon Z, Sony E and Leica L mount. The optical design is the same for all the three versions, and all the three versions have full electronic support, including autofocus, auto aperture, EXIF data. I'm testing the L mount version in this review, but most of the test results should be the same even if you're using a Sony or Nikon camera. The price of this lens is US $339, so it's quite a big jump from the last Meike 85 1.8 lens that I have reviewed, which only costs around $200. It does suggest Meike is quite confident with this lens, and therefore the price is a lot higher. But at the same time, the price is getting really a bit close to the first party 85mm f1.8 lenses in the market. For example, the official price of the Lumix S 85 1.8 is $600, but you can get it quite a bit cheaper when there are discounts. This is the same for the Sony 85 1.8. So in this review, I'll be comparing this $339 Meike with the $600 Lumix S 85 1.8 and see how big is the difference between these two lenses. Before we start, I want to tell you the lens sample I used in this review was sent to me by Meike. I do not have to return the sample after this review, but I also did not receive any money for this review. I do have an affiliated link in the video description below if you want to purchase this lens. I just want to make sure everything is clear before we start. Okay, we'll look at the image sharpness first. All the test photos and videos in this review were shot using a 24MP Lumix S5 II. And let's start with the center sharpness. At f1.8, the Meike's center sharpness is okay. The Lumix is a bit sharper. Stopping down to f2.8, the Meike is now very sharp, pretty much the same as the Lumix. Center sharpness remains the same until we reach around f11. And we'll look at the corners now. At wide open, Meike's corner sharpness is not bad, but once again the Lumix is slightly sharper, but the difference isn't very big. At f2.8, Meike's corner is now pretty sharp, even slightly sharper than the Lumix. Once we stop down to f4, corner sharpness remains pretty much the same for both lenses until we reach f11. All the corner sharpness test photos that you just saw were focused at the center of the photo. When shooting at f1.8, focus at the center or focus at the corner of the photo doesn't make any noticeable difference to the corner sharpness. However, if I focus at the corner and shoot at f1.8, then the center would be slightly out of focus for both lenses, which suggests the lens may have a little bit of field curvature. The minimum focus distance for the Meike is 85cm, which is slightly longer than the Lumix, which is 80cm. And here are two photos shot at the minimum focus distance with both lenses. The Meike has slightly lower magnification than the Lumix. From my own measurements, the Meike's maximum magnification ratio is around 0.11 times, which is slightly lower than most other first-party 85 1.8 lenses, which are usually around 0.12 to 0.13 times. The Lumix is 0.13 times as well. But the good thing with the Meike is that the image quality when you are shooting at the minimum focus distance is still pretty good. Even when you are shooting at f1.8, the image is sharp and it has very minimal amount of chromatic aberration. In comparison, while the Lumix is also sharp, but the Lumix has more noticeable chromatic aberration, and I need to stop down to f2.8 to minimize that. 85mm focal length with f1.8 aperture means it's quite easy to dissolve the background when you're shooting portrait or anything at close distance. In terms of the quality of the dissolved background, the Meike renders pretty nice, pleasant looking bokeh. The bokeh doesn't look nervous, and I don't see any onion ring effect, and there's only minor cat's eye bokeh. If we compare the Meike with the Lumix, at f1.8, the bokeh looks quite similar between these two lenses, not a lot of difference. If we stop down to f4, it's pretty much the same. The bokeh from these two lenses seems very similar. The bokeh looks quite smooth and natural, very pleasant, but doesn't have strong character. We look at vignetting now. With the vignetting correction enabled, the Meike has very minimal amount of vignetting when you're shooting at f1.8. The Meike has even less vignetting than the Lumix. However, when you stop down the lens to f2.8, the Meike now has a bit of reverse vignetting, which means the corners are brighter than the center of the image. And it remains the same when you stop down the lens further. This happens with quite a lot of third-party lenses that I've reviewed recently. I believe it's because the lens profile is not quite optimized. We don't have this problem with the Lumix or any other first-party lenses. So if I disable vignetting correction, now there is a bit more vignetting at f1.8, but the Meike still has less vignetting than the Lumix. Once we stop down the lens to f2.8, the Meike already has very minimal amount of vignetting, so that's excellent. Because of that, I will recommend you just disable vignetting correction if you can when you are shooting with this Meike lens. When shooting high contrast photos, I can see a small amount of color fringing, but the amount of color fringing is really quite minor and better than most lenses in the market. Even when I compared it with the Lumix, if you look at this photo, you can see the Lumix has stronger magenta and green color fringing than the Meike. I was a bit surprised because this is another area the Meike is a bit better than the Lumix. Distortion control is pretty decent with this Meike lens. If you look at these brick wall test photos, look at the bottom. Meike has a tiny amount of pincushion distortion, but the Lumix is pretty much the same. Now, this is with the distortion correction enabled, which for Meike, it actually doesn't do anything. If I disable Lumix distortion correction, then the Lumix has a little bit more distortion than the Meike now, but I think the amount of distortion is still very minimal. These test photos were shot within 30 seconds with the same exposure settings and the same fixed white balance setting. It seems the photo shot with the Meike is a bit warmer than the Lumix, while the field of view is slightly tighter. Meike's lens flare performance is usually quite good, and with this 85mm f1.8 Pro, the lens flare performance is also quite decent. Even when I shoot directly into the sun, I don't get too much lens flare or ghosting. Contrast also remains quite good. If you look at this side-by-side comparison with the Lumix, Lumix has almost perfect lens flare control. Meike has a little bit more lens flare and ghosting, but this is really quite an extreme test, and I think Meike's performance is not bad at all. With the Meike lens, if you want to have some Sunstars in the photos, you need to stop down the lens to around f8, then you can see Sunstars. This is slightly better than the Lumix, which you need to stop down a bit more to around f11 to get similar kind of Sunstars. When stopped down to the minimum aperture f16, the Sunstars from the Meike is a bit sharper than the Lumix, as the Lumix Sunstar tails spread out a bit more. However, Meike's Sunstar shape seems a bit uneven. Some of the tails are a bit longer than some other tails. I personally don't really like that, and I prefer Lumix more symmetrical Sunstars. But Sunstar is really quite an subjective thing, so maybe let me know which one you prefer more. Next, we'll have a look at focus breathing, and I was really surprised by my test result. Look at my focus breathing test that I change focus between 1 and 20 meter focus distance. Usually, Lumix lenses has strong video focus, but the Lumix 85mm lens still has a moderate amount of focus breathing. You can see the focus breathing quite easily. But if we look at the Meike, there is almost no focus breathing at all. This really surprised me, as I was expecting Meike would have worse focus breathing performance than the Lumix, but turns out Meike performs exceptionally well in this area. The Meike uses STM autofocus motor. When I shoot photo, the autofocus speed is pretty much the same as the Lumix 85mm lens. The autofocus is also very quiet. Once again, almost the same as the Lumix. You can only hear a tiny bit of autofocus noise if you're shooting in a very quiet place and you put your ear next to the camera. When I reviewed the Meike 50mm f1.8 for L mount, in the review I mentioned if I change the manual focus settings on the camera, like linear versus non-linear, and the angle for the linear focusing, all these settings didn't work with the Meike 50mm lens. Manual focus direction is also opposite to the Lumix lens, so because of that, I didn't recommend the Meike 50mm lens to people who want to manual focus. But this time, with this new Meike 85mm f1.8 Pro, everything works exactly as expected. The manual focus ring turns in the same direction as the Lumix. The linear and non-linear manual focus mode both works, and the focus ring angle setting also works perfectly. So if you want to manual focus, this Meike lens works just exactly as good as the first-party Lumix lens now. So great job, Meike! When shooting video, the Meike also works really well. Even when I was shooting at f1.8, continuous autofocus works pretty much flawlessly when I use human detection to follow my movements. Autofocus is fast and accurate, and the transition is very smooth. As far as I can see, the video autofocus performance is virtually identical to the Lumix lens. We'll have a look at the design and construction of this Meike lens now. This Meike lens is a reasonably compact 85mm f1.8 lens. It's only slightly larger than the Lumix S 85 f1.8, and the weight of the lens is around 390 grams, which is not bad. The lens has a pretty small 62mm front filter thread, and it also comes with a reversible plastic lens hood. This lens is one of Meike's first Pro lens. I'm not too sure what defines Pro for Meike, but when I see the word Pro, I would expect the product delivers very good performance and also has very good build quality. Unfortunately, I don't think this Meike lens really meet my expectation when it comes to the body construction. Firstly, the body of this Meike lens is made of plastic. While this is the same for the Lumix S 85 1.8, the Lumix is also made of plastic, but the Meike lens just feels a lot more plasticky and cheaper. All the letters, logos are just printed on the lens, so all this together just make the lens feels very budget. And the second thing, this Meike lens is not a weather sealed lens. I would really have thought a Pro lens should be at least weather sealed. But on the positive side, this lens has a metal lens mount, and there's a big red rubber seal on the lens mount, which should provide some weather protection around the lens mount at least. There's also a USB-C port on the lens mount for firmware update. The lens also has an aperture ring. On the aperture ring, there's some special pattern to make it easier to control the aperture ring. The aperture ring has clicks, and each click is 1/3 of a stop from the maximum aperture f1.8 to the minimum aperture f16. Then there is the A setting after f16, which hands the aperture control back to the camera dial. The click at f16 feels exactly the same as any other clicks, so it's quite easy to rotate the aperture ring past f16 to A if you are rotating the aperture ring quickly and not careful. There's also a switch for you to switch between manual and autofocus. If we consider this lens as a budget lens, then the build quality is okay. But even if I ignore the Pro name, there are many other budget full-frame autofocus lenses that are either cheaper or about the same price as this Meike, and they have more premium build quality. So I would really like to see something that is a bit more refined or premium in terms of build quality from Meike in the future. This is already the third L-mount autofocus lens that I tested on this channel, which could actually be the fourth or fifth if I wasn't so busy. And I can see some very noticeable improvements that Meike has made within such a short period of time. The image quality of this 85mm f1.8 Pro is very good. Apart from sharpness is slightly worse than the Lumix at maximum aperture, and there is a little bit more lens flare. For everything else, the Meike would either match or even better than the Lumix. And this is not an easy task, as the Lumix S 85 1.8 delivers really solid performance. Autofocus also works really well in both photo and video mode. Meike has also fixed some of the firmware issues that I've complained in the past, like some of the manual focus settings that didn't work, or the opposite manual focus control direction. The only thing that I can really complain would be the very plasticky construction that really feels cheap, and the lens is also not weatherproof. With the Pro name and the higher price compared to the previous Meike, I really think Meike should either make the body feels a little bit more premium or make it a weatherproof lens. But I think the biggest challenge for Meike is that there are a lot of 85mm f1.8 lenses in the market, and the only thing that makes this Meike lens stand out is that it has an aperture ring, while all the other 85 f1.8 lenses in the market, as far as I know, don't have the aperture ring. Now, don't get me wrong, I think this lens delivers really solid performance, but the market just has so many 85mm f1.8 lenses. It is really a very saturated market. But what do you guys think about this Meike 85mm f1.8 Pro? Would you be interested in getting this lens? I would like to hear your thoughts, but you can also tell me what do you want Meike to work on next. I myself would love to see a compact pancake autofocus lens from Meike, especially if Meike can make one for the L-mount.